Matt said, this is part of a wider project, and I'm hoping to sort of finish up research this summer and publish this into an article in progress of that wider project. So happy to sort of have any comments and feedback that you have in relation to this. I want to start tonight by looking at this image. And so this picture comes from the archive of the British Salvation Army, and it relates to the organization's relief work in Germany after World War II. And the photograph is undated, but we can see it depicts either two girls or a girl and a boy. And just after what looks to be having finished, cups of hot chocolate. And you can just sort of see the traces of chocolate kind of around their mouths here. So it's a very sort of sweet image. But it sort of represents a drink that was quite common form of food relief provided to children such as these through British voluntary societies working in post-war Germany at this time, and indeed throughout Europe. In British societies such as the Salvation Army, worked under the umbrella organization known as the Council of British Societies for Relief Abroad, or COBSRA as it was known, from 1945 to 1950 to facilitate a supplemental British feeding scheme in Europe, providing cocoa and other consumables to support the consumption needs of women, children, the elderly, and the infirm in places such as displaced persons assembly centers, hospitals, children's homes, and school cafeterias. So by September 1946, for example, COBSRA voluntary societies were helping to feed 120,000 children daily in the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin areas of Germany, while also feeding an additional 30,000 children in the areas of the North Rhine and Westphalia. COBSRA's ability to provide British food relief to the people of Europe was not an easy feat to accomplish in the shifting political and economic climate at the end of the Second World War. And as the conflict drew to a close, the British government was eager to retain its power in the world and sought to do so through closer ties with Europe. However, Britain's global influence was in decline, and it increasingly turned to the United States for financial and political support, particularly over the issue of German Reconstruction. David Reynolds and David Dibbleby have argued that the US-UK relationship went through several iterations in this period in the late 1940s. And some historians suggest that America regressed into its pre-war isolationist stance until it instituted the Marshall Plan in 1948. Other historians argue that the coordinated wartime military and diplomatic activities between the US and the UK broke up at this period. Still, other historians state that these alliances were still maintained, but they were much more informal after the war. The changes that took place in the relationship were impacted by Britain's wartime debt, its retrenchment from international obligations, and the growing global dominance of the United States. However, despite these post-war shifts, Brian Perkins points out the US and the UK remained in partnership with each other, but it was unequal association. On the continent, these changes in the Anglo-American relationship were manifested in the types and amount of relief that were provided to the people of Europe through Allied activities and organizations. The most prominent Allied reconstruction effort was undertaken by the US-led United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which worked with displaced persons and nationals of UN member states. But as Jessica Reinisch and George Woodbridge have demonstrated, UNRWA, of the UNRWA's work, was often contested among the Allies, suggesting post-war tensions between these participating nations. Individual voluntary organizations, such as the British Red Cross, also played a significant role in facilitating post-war rehabilitation and relief in Europe. And played a central role in organizing British relief to Europe after the war through its member societies. Some historians, such as Jonas Dieter Steinert, have touched on COBSRA's work to support the rehabilitation needs of Germany from 1945 onwards. But the Council's construction of a supplemental British food program involving societies such as the British Red Cross and the Salvation Army to support the consumption needs of Europeans has not been analyzed. Equally absent is an analysis of the connection between British food relief and transatlantic relationships. This is a significant omission because the shifting political and economic dimensions of the US-UK relationship directly and indirectly influenced the structure and level of relief that COBSRA was able to provide to the continent. In tonight's lecture, I will explore the activities of the Council of British Societies for Relief Abroad from 1945 to 1947, to ascertain the nature and extent of its food relief program to Europe, and more significantly, to Germany. Through this research, I will trace how Kopfler's program shaped and trained by the changing Anglo-American relationship. This study will reveal Kopfler's crucial role in facilitating British food aid on the continent and furnish a new way in which to view the war and post-war Anglo-American relationships through British food relief. Britain was committed to providing material relief to Europe after the conflict, but the UK's ability to do so was shaped and in most cases hindered by the limited resources available to it at the end of the conflict. During the war, from January 1940 onwards, the British government instituted a program of food rationing for every man, woman, and child living on the British home front. So items such as meat, cheese, sugar, and butter were controlled. So although they were under rationing, Britain still constituted and sent food to the continent at the end of the war. So you have this sort of tension going on. And historians estimate that the UK provided up to 2 million tons of food for the continent between the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944 and June 1946. So on the home front, the British tightened their belts to support Europe as UK rationing worsened in peacetime. Although Britain provided material help to the continent, it was severely in debt to the United States for goods obtained through the Lend-Lease program. Britain was sort of the largest beneficiary of this program and received over $13 billion worth of supplies between March 1942 and October 1945. And the British Empire received an additional $30 billion in supplies over this same period. So the final settlement for the repayment of this Lend-Lease goods stipulated that Britain had to pay the United States $650 million. So this sort of quite an economic significance. And the Lend-Lease debt and a subsequent 50-year loan from the US to the UK in 1946 for $3.75 billion put Britain in quite economic straits this time. And the British government instituted deeper domestic austerity measures to curb these expenses and help to pay these debts while also sustaining its empire and other international obligations, including the reconstruction of Europe. Food rationing was prolonged until 1954 in order to reduce these expenses and to return to economic solvency, but also to help feed Europe. Food supplies in Britain were largely dependent on food imports, as the country could not agriculturally sustain itself. And in order to reduce import expenses, Britain turned to its empire and its Commonwealth for its consumables, limiting most food imports to the Stirling area. Officials even urged people to use food substitutes from the empire, such as whale meat and snook, a fish native to the Caribbean, to replace the costly import of meat from countries not in the Stirling area. And these were very unpopular things in the post-war period, so they didn't last very long, but they were trying to sort of solve this debt problem. Such limitations further restricted the amount and types of food available in Britain and to its consumers, and available for food relief to Europe. Britain also committed itself to providing significant financial support to the continent towards the end of the war. So in 1943, when the Allied powers led by the United States formed the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation, Britain was contributing to these costs. Overall, the budget of UNRA was approximately $3 billion. And it provided relief and support to over 5 million displaced persons and native peoples throughout Europe between 1943 and 1947. And in Britain, in its turn, it's estimated that it contributed 80 million pounds to the organization to facilitate it. So again, it's sort of its economic obligations that are going on. Not only did it sort of lend its financial support to the continent, it also provided its human capital. So the Council of British Societies for Relief Abroad was vital in facilitating the work that British voluntary societies carried out in conjunction with military authorities and UNRWA on the continent. In 1942, Britain's Board of Trade asked British voluntary societies to form a cooperative council to pool their resources and to coordinate efforts for future relief in Europe. The result of these meetings was the formation of the overarching body known as the Consultative Council of Voluntary Organizations for the Relief of Suffering and Social Recovery in March 1943. So that's quite a mouthful. So they decided to shorten the title and it became known as the Council of British Societies for Relief Abroad, or COBSRA. In total, 46 British-based organizations joined COBSRA over its lifetime, so from 1943 till 1957 when it closed. And these organizations ranged from non-denominational to religious organizations to sort of civic groups. But only 12 of these societies sent teams to Europe at the end of the war. And here you can see the list of the organizations that were involved in sending teams. So it's quite varied, just like COBSRA was, sort of all different foci in these groups. So COBSRA acted as the facilitating organization for these voluntary societies, raising their issues and concerns with the British government and coordinating all British voluntary efforts abroad. In order to operate abroad, voluntary societies not only had to have their application processed by COBSRA and approved by the Foreign Office, they also had to become members of the Council. Membership fees to COBSRA from voluntary societies and later individual donations helped to pay for 50% of the Council's costs, while the government provided the additional 50% funding needed to facilitate COBSRA's programs. As relief efforts began to take shape in Europe in 1943 and 1944, the Allies put mechanisms in place to oversee the work of all voluntary organizations wishing to work on the continent. COBSRA, as the gatekeeper for all British voluntary societies interested in working abroad, fully expected to organize British matters for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. However, American military dominance on the continent, from the D-Day landings in 1944 to victory in Europe in May 1945, had an impact on the structure that British relief would take in the post-war period. U.S. Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who you see here, who was the commander of the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, which was the inter-allied organization which oversaw Allied forces in the Northwest Europe, stipulated in 1944 that he would only work with the American and British Red Crosses and no other voluntary organizations to help Europeans recover from the war. General Eisenhower appointed the British Red Cross as the umbrella organization to manage all British societies working in Europe, so essentially upending the already established framework put in place by the British government in 1943 for British voluntary societies to carry out work on the continent through COBSRA. The British government in COBSRA had little choice but to acquiesce to Eisenhower's directive as SHAEF commander. And according to COBSRA's chair, Richard Law, who you see pictured here, quote, "It was agreed that COBSRA should, as it were, recognize the British Red Cross as its operational arm in Northwest Europe, but that the other societies should contribute their own units and preserve their own identity within the British Red Cross framework," end quote. This shift in British voluntary societies relief efforts illustrates the unequal US-UK relationship. America's control over European reconstruction efforts superseded any British plans on the continent. In this climate of financial, material, and international uncertainty, the Council approached the British government in February 1945 about setting up a voluntary society-led food initiative on the continent to supplement the food available to the people of Europe from military authorities and from UNRWA. The program was essential, COBSRA argued, because vulnerable individuals, i.e. women, children, the elderly, and the infirmed, were not receiving the right amount and types of food needed to meet their special nutritional requirements from other sources such as UNRWA. UNRWA food relief was set at a standard daily 200-calorie diet, which did not differentiate for the nutritional requirements of these groups that COBSRA wished to target. Nevertheless, UNRWA was able to offer a variety of foods to native and displaced persons on the continent. And here you can see the list of the foods that UNRWA was giving, and it's quite varied. And several of these foodstuffs would have been suitable for the nutritional needs of women, children, the elderly, and the infirmed. So foods such as dairies, roots, soy products, cod liver oil, that sort of thing would have been very beneficial for the groups. However, other things such as beverages, which in this case I take to mean alcoholic, it doesn't say it, but I take that, as well as cigarettes and tobacco, much less beneficial for these groups. And so it's quite varied what they're offering. However, despite the UN's best efforts, it was never able to reach its 2,000-calorie diet for the millions of people that were under its care due to poor harvests, fluctuations in world food supplies, administrative disagreements between the member countries, and the inability or the unwillingness of these countries to meet their quotas for the UNRWA relief program. Because of the shortcomings in UNRWA's relief efforts, specifically for special needs groups, COPTRA made its case to the US government. However, COPTRA's request met with mixed reaction from the British government. Some officials within the Ministry of Food objected to a program which they felt was of little consequence and unnecessary in comparison with the other food that the British government was already sending to Europe. Officials saw little merit in further reducing the domestic market so that more could be sent to the continent, feeling that enough had already been sacrificed. Others in the Ministry of Food questioned the necessity of COPTRA's request in light of the financial support Britain was already lending to the relief efforts of UNRWA, suggesting that COPTRA was unnecessarily seeking to replicate UNRWA's relief efforts. Instead, the ministry recommended that COPTRA voluntary societies work under the auspices of UNRWA to help distribute the relief that was available, allowing the government to conserve its financial and material resources. Food levels on the British home front and the political ramifications of these controls were a continual worry for the government since the inception of rationing in 1940. COPTRA's demand for the additional food relief to Europe, while Britain was still under rationing, added to the Ministry of Food's concerns surrounding public morale and the political fallout from the relief scheme. But other officials understood the positive political capital that the wartime coalition government would obtain by allowing the scheme to go ahead. In an MOF memo from J.E. Wall, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Ministry of Food, to Sir Herbert Broadley, the Second Secretary in the Ministry, on the 15th of March, 1945, Wall underlined this point. So this is Broadley here, but this is Wall writing the letter. And he writes, quote, "This demand is relatively small, particularly in comparison with the goodwill which it will undoubtedly create," unquote. So even in the government, they're not quite sure what they want to do. Wall understood that the benefits of COPTRA's relief efforts outweighed the costs to the government in carrying it out. The program would not simply provide help to those in need, but it would also give be affirmative to public relations at home and abroad, giving a political boost to the government despite the continuation of food rationing. Contrary to officials' fears, many members of the British public, as well as aid organizations, were putting pressure on the government to do more to help the continent. Indeed, it was these political pressures from below which invariably helped to override the dissenting voices in the government and to persuade officials to reach an agreement with COPTRA in April 1945. The importance of these considerations in bringing about the agreement is evident in a letter dated the 9th of June 1945, written by Mr. Huntley in the External Relations Division of the Ministry of Food. So again, this is Huntley reading. So quote, "The Ministry of Food accepted this commitment under considerable political pressure, which is backed by the Foreign Office. From my point of view, this token gesture to COPTRA will materially strengthen our hand in turning down requests from individual relief societies to be allowed to export foodstuffs, and from members of the public who wish to send parcels abroad. Recently, the claims through both of these channels have been frequent and vociferous." COPTRA's feeding scheme acted as a safety valve for British officials to relieve political pressure from the public, which wanted the government to support the consumption needs of Europe. Agreeing to provide additional relief to voluntary societies took the political pressure off of the government and its policies. COPTRA was a beneficiary of this political wrangling, enabling it to begin shipping food to Europe in July 1945 under the newly elected Labour government. The new agreement between the British government and COPTRA stipulated that the Ministry of Food would enable the Council to purchase up to 1,000 tons of food from its available stocks in Britain. The 1,000-ton food program, as it came to be known, allowed the Council to buy food during a 6-month period from July to December 1945. Although the Council obtained these foods domestically from the MOF, the organization was not allowed to purchase the goods using any of the government grant money that was allocated to it. The government's funding was strictly to be used to support the Council's work with military authorities and with UNRWA, as well as for the general running costs of the organization, such as its salaries insurance, and travel expenses. Instead, COPSA turned to its internal sources of money, including membership fees collected from the voluntary societies, to pay for these foodstuffs. The foods requested by individual voluntary societies from the MOF were not to include items that could be obtained through UNRWA, and were to support the consumption requirements of these special needs groups. Societies asked the MOF for foods that were rich in vitamins, carbohydrates, and protein. And many of these goods were also milk-based products. And here you can see the original list of foods that they requested. You see that, right? Sorry, the light is a little bit funny here. Yeah. So these are the list of original list of goods and quantities in tons that they requested in May 1945. And so you can see things like cocoa, skimmed milk powder, soya flour, wheat flour, sugar, so a variety of different things being requested. It's interesting to know that if you add up these numbers, the total only equals 900 tons rather than the 1,000 that they were allocated. And this may indicate that the list was not finalized by May, or that societies had not, been able to find the 100 tons of goods of the 1,000-ton allocation that they wanted to purchase. And the record doesn't tell me why this doesn't add up. And the foodstuffs on this list demonstrate that they were tailored to the consumption requirements of the women and the children, the elderly, and the infirm. So you have some milk products and sort of very health beneficial products. The foods offered also suggest the impact of food rationing on all levels and on overall levels and types of consumables available on the home front by 1945. So, for example, the MOF most likely offered COPSA margarine rather than butter because it needed to preserve valuable butter supplies to be able to fulfill the domestic British ration, because you only see margarine. Wheat flour levels were also tightly controlled by the government in wartime as wheat imports fluctuated. And here you can see wheat on this list as well, but in addition to wheat, you can see that the government also offered 3 other types of flour. So you have soya, barley, and oat flour as well listed there. And these 3 types of flour added up to 180 tons of food, which is nearly double the amount of the wheat flour that's offered. And these types of flour may have been offered because they were less costly than the wheat flour that had to be imported, and more readily available in the domestic market. These other types of flour could also have been provided by the government because of their health benefits associated with them. So soya or soy flour, for example, was used by UNRWA to make up for nutritional deficiencies in the basic ration that it was able to offer. Barley and oat flour are equally beneficial. So barley flour is high in fiber and low in starch, and oat flour is packed with protein and carbohydrates. So making these foods useful in supporting the nutritional requirements of these special groups that they were tailored to. It is important to know that many of the items on this list, including most of the milk-based products and the dried egg, were only available in the British market because of the American wartime program of Lend-Lease. And if you look again at the list, you will see that I've starred the items which are supplied to Britain through Lend-Lease. So again, we have things like skimmed milk powder, full cream dried milk, full fat soya powder, dried egg, and so on. Okay, so those are all based on what Britain can get in from the Lend-Lease program. So of the 16 goods that I've listed here, 6 of the items totaling 400 tons of the overall 1,000-ton food allocation were, in fact, Lend-Lease goods. So thus nearly half of the goods promised to COPSA from the MOF rested on the availability of American sort of products in the British market. In May 1945, the Ministry of Food cabled the British Food Mission in Washington, D.C. to advise them about the feeding scheme. And the British Food Mission was a division of the British government which worked with the U.S. government, the U.S. Foreign Economic Administration, to organize and ship foods to Britain. So they were in charge of the Lend-Lease negotiations that were going on. So they're cabling them to sort of check about the program. So most likely to check, the feasibility of the program. Was it workable? And so this may have been taken in light of a new clause that was recently added to the Lend-Lease Act by the U.S. Congress in April of that year, which prohibited sort of the use of Lend-Lease goods for post-war relief and rehabilitation. So there was I think there was some uncertainty going on there. about what could and could not be done. So in the cable, the Ministry of Food emphasizes the significance of the Lend-Lease goods to COBRA's food relief program, so allowing it to go ahead. So this is the cable that the British government said. So, quote, "We attach great importance to putting the scheme into operation, and its success depends to a large extent on obtaining Lend-Lease goods," end quote. Okay, so that's what they said. However, the use of Lend-Lease for the proposed food program met with resistance in Washington. The British Food Mission expressed concern over the scheme and doubted its viability, particularly where American goods were involved. So this is the cable that they sent back. So, quote, "FEA," so that's the U.S. Foreign Economic Administration, which was the counterpoint to British Food Mission, "FEA will almost certainly object to what they would regard as political advantage gained by the UK out of Lend-Lease supplies," end quote. So the cable reveals the restrictions placed on the U.S. aid and the strains on the U.S.-UK relationship. The Foreign Economic Administration, or FEA, was willing to support Britain in wartime, but not to provide it with the political capital on the continent at the expense of America's own interests and involvement there. The U.S. was not prepared to allow Britain to use Lend-Lease for its continental relief. This and a subsequent telegram from the British Food Mission advised the ministry to withdraw the Lend-Lease supplies from the list of goods that it made available to COBRA. In light of these messages from Washington, the MOF had no choice but to withdraw foodstuffs that originated in the United States from the list of consumables that it could offer to COBRA. Because America was the primary supplier to Britain of dried eggs and many of the milk-based goods that had to be withdrawn, some of those earlier, from the list, the UK government found it difficult and in many cases impossible to replace the types and quantities of foods originally promised to COBRA. The abrupt cancellation of Lend-Lease in August 1945 after victory in the Pacific and Britain's heavy dependence on imports from America further impacted the types and amount of food that the MOF could provide to COBRA from its domestic supplies. However, despite these setbacks, the British government worked to meet COBRA's food relief objectives by using available surpluses from a variety of sources to reach the totals required. The ministry agreed that COBRA could take up an additional 50 tons of margarine and stipulated that the amount of malt products and cod liver oil needed by the voluntary societies to reach their combined total of 70 tons, so they let them sort of substitute things. Officials also utilized residual stocks of goods, which were not in sufficient large enough quantities to be used on the domestic ration, which included unused British Red Cross prisoner of war parcels and British military ration packs. And these different avenues through which the Ministry of Food obtained consumables or COBRA scheme resulted in the allocation of 22 different foodstuffs to volunteer societies on the council. I wanted to show you the list of goods. So this is the revised list after they're taken off the American. You can see it's quite varied. There are more on this list than there are on the original one. So this list is still in keeping with this original goal of providing food to support the nutritional requirements of the special needs groups. And it does differ from UNRWA, what UNRWA is able to provide, as we saw earlier. The diversity of the consumables on the list resulted from the government having to piece together the food available in Britain, while not using the Lend-Lease goods and also not diminishing the domestic British ration. And if we examine the individual foods available, we can make some assumptions about where they came from. So I've made various star notes here. So the goods with one star next to them. So for example, cocoa, semolina, sugar, margarine, like that. These appeared on the original list of foodstuffs offered to COBRA from MOF stock. So they transferred over. The consumables with 2 stars. So for example, Vita, chocolate, so on, were presumably found in the British Red Cross prisoner of war parcels. So you have tin cheese, canned fish, chocolate, such like that. The other goods were most likely further supplies released from the MOF, goods obtained from the MOF from British manufacturers, or foods that came from unused military packs. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly where everything came from, but sort of that's my beginning thoughts on that. It's also interesting to note that wheat flour, which appeared on the original list, is missing from this revised list. No explanation is given in the record as to why this was removed from the list, the second list. but it can be presumed that the supply of wheat was either needed on the British home front or it was given to UNRWA or military authorities because it sort of was in short supply quite often. Many of the organizations on COPTA's council participated in this first allocation of British food to the continent. In all, 9 groups were involved in this first relief program. And again, I wanted to show you the list. And again, it's showing the sort of diversity of organizations that are sitting on COPTA, how sort of inclusive it is. So all of these organizations were involved in distributing the foods to the special needs groups in the places that they're working. So to displaced peoples, as well as native peoples, except for those living in Germany. And I wanted to show you the list. So these are the different countries in which the organizations are working. This is where they're sending the food abroad. And so I've got 14 countries listed here. So 9 of the 14, and I've starred those as well, were also receiving food from UNRWA. So they were, and some were not. So it's a sort of combination. So this suggests that much, but not all, of British Voluntary Society's work was connected to the activities of the UN on the continent, but not all. And as I said, they were giving food to people in Germany, but only displaced persons. So at this moment, there was a policy against feeding sort of native Germans, native, women, children. And this policy of the UK also matched UNRWA's policy, so they sort of worked hand in hand. However, by the latter half of 1945, Britain's policy would change in this respect, and I want to go on and talk a bit about that. In the summer of 1945, as COPTA embarked on its food relief program, British officials became increasingly concerned about the level of food available in Germany. Officials worried about the possibility of starvation and the spread of disease in Germany over the coming winter months. So Field Marshal Montgomery, who you see pictured here, who oversaw the military occupation of the British zone in 1945, began raising his concerns with the UK government in late summer about the decline in the food levels and the overall living conditions in Germany. And what came to be known as the Battle for Winter in the press, the issue of feeding Germany and supporting its recovery was very much debated in Parliament and in the media in late 1945. John Farquhar Harson argues that although Montgomery petitioned the government for further shipments of foodstuffs to Germany, many British officials were resistant to the idea of providing more aid to the country. But the changing political concerns in Germany and their connection to food relief also weighed on UK officials. As Joseph Foshpath points out, Germans perceived themselves to be the victims of Allied ineptitude, which they believed caused them severe hardship and hunger in the post-war years of occupation. The negative perception of the Allies' occupation policies, particularly in relation to their ability to provide food to the civilian population, posed a real threat to the establishment of Western democracy and the future stability of Europe. Alice Weinreeb argues that it was the perception of hunger in Germany and the political threat of communism to the stability in the region which influenced British and American humanitarian efforts in Germany in the post-war period. And these considerations motivated the British government to reverse its policy and to begin sending supplies to feed German civilians living in the zone, sort of late 45 and onwards. And this change in position enabled COPTA to alter its food relief program as well, enlarging its activities and expanding the number of special needs groups that it fed throughout Europe. It also set COPTA's work somewhat apart from the activities of UNRWA, which never altered its policy about feeding German civilians. And this divergence in UNRWA and British government policies enabled COPTA to successfully lobby for its own headquarters in Vlotho, Germany, under the direction of British Red Cross, to retain the internal administration of its teams, effectively organize its food relief program, and to pool its food relief supplies for distribution to the different voluntary societies in the British zone. Such a move suggests that COPTA possessed a level of independence from the American-led UN policies around food relief in Germany. However, COPTA's actions were still within the structure of the Red Cross operational control on the continent, continuing and working within rather than breaking from American directives. The British government's change in policy towards Germany undoubtedly strengthened Kopsch's hand in obtaining a second relief agreement from the Ministry of Food in the autumn of 1945. Officials agreed to provide Kopsch with an additional 4,200 tons of food for the continent from January to June 1946, which this time would be used to feed German nationals, German special interest groups. And the cost of obtaining the second round of foodstuffs from the MLF was £100,000, but the council did not have enough money to pay for the second allocation. So Kopsch decided to create a public appeal to raise donations to be able to purchase this food from the MLF. So in December 1945, it launched its Food Relief Fund by placing advertisements in a variety of national, provincial, and religious newspapers, including the News Chronicle and the Times, to promote its relief activities and to solicit donations from the public. And the first advertisement for the appeal appeared in the Times on the 21st of December 1945. And I just want to give you an overall look. This is the original appeal in the Times. And I want to go in and highlight sort of the beginning bit of it and talk a bit about that. So this is sort of near the beginning. So, quote, "At this Christmas season, many people would like to send gifts of food to relieve distress in Europe. This is not yet possible, but there's yet another way to help. So donating money to Kopsch or any of its individual volunteer societies participating in the Food Relief Fund gave the British public the opportunity to help to provide food relief to Europe without interfering with the food rationing mechanisms by sending food parcels abroad. Indeed, Kopsch sought to emphasize to the British public that they would not be supplying the means by which home front rations, which were often fluctuating at this time, would be cut." And then going on again here, quote, "The organizations which we represent can now, by arrangement with the Ministry of Food, acquire a supply of foodstuffs not in general demand in this country, but of value from relief work." End quote. So this appeal endeavored to reassure the public that its own consumption needs were paramount to any scheme that was put in place to feed Europe. The advertisement was quick to point out that the food would go to those who most required it in Europe, these special needs groups, rather than the general public. The appeal also pointed out that the distribution will be regardless of race, nationality, and creed. Such language reflects the impact of the British government's changing foreign policy on Kopsch's expanding program of food relief to Germany. 8 of the 9 organizations which had participated in the first distribution of food relief from the MLF were also involved in the Food Relief Fund. And again, I want to show you the list. I think Salvation Army didn't participate in the first one, so now it's participating here. I'm in the second one. Once the appeal was launched, it made steady progress toward its goal of £100,000. So by April 1946, it had reached and then exceeded its goal. By May, the Food Relief Fund stood at over £114,000. And as a result of Kopsch's publicity efforts, they had 9,820 donations. And these were received from across the United Kingdom. So not only were they individual donors, but they were diverse community and university groups such as the Hartlepool Chamber of Commerce and the Cambridge University Mission. So quite a varied, sort of matching the organizations that were involved in Kopsch as well. So although public donations to Kopsch continued throughout 1946, the year brought fresh challenges to the UK and the Anglo-American relationship, affecting British relief efforts on the continent. The first half of the year saw a dramatic downturn in the world's supply of wheat due to poor harvests and increased demand over supply, much of that supply coming from the United States. According to Farquhar-Harson, world cereal levels were impacted by the American farmers' proclivity to hold back grains for higher prices, and the USDA's inability to entice farmers to offer higher supply levels to the market. Such actions caused the global food market to tighten, which led to reductions in the wheat supplies on the British home front and the volume of rations available in the UK zone in Germany. The British government lobbied the US government for further wheat supplies to relieve the situation in Europe, particularly in Germany. But Farquhar-Harson points out that, quote, the first 5 months of 1946 were marked by constant American pressure to get British domestic food reserves reduced in order to lessen the burden on the US Department of Agriculture in respect to the UK zone, end quote. After negotiations between the two countries on the issue of wheat supplies to Germany, the US did agree to draw down 200,000 tons of grain from its domestic supplies and to divert an additional 675,000 tons of wheat imports from Britain to Germany between May and September 1946. And in exchange, the U.S. government agreed to replenish British domestic wheat levels with American supplies. However, after Britain had reduced its domestic wheat supply to feed Germany, the United States reneged on its promise to send supplies to Britain, putting a severe drain on British resources and helping to lead to the introduction of bread rationing in Britain in July 1946. The consumption restrictions placed on the British populace because of the supplies issue invariably had an impact on the food that the MOF could offer to Koptra in this second allocation. Although the MOF had made provision for over 4,000 tons of food relief to the voluntary societies, Koptra found that the goods offered did not necessarily fit with the nutritional requirements of these special needs groups. And according to Koptra Secretary Dwight D. Hogarth in January 1946, quote, "The allocation, while it's very welcome, is poorly balanced, and in particular is short in milk and milk substitute baby foods, sugars, and fats," end quote. Of the 4,200 tons of food offered to Koptra by the British government, 3,100 tons of food came in the form of tinned liquid soup. It is not clear why, but voluntary societies viewed soup as incompatible to requirements, and they refused to purchase it. So leaving only 1,100 tons of food that could be sort of obtained through the MOF. The Ministry of Food offered societies 400 tons from Army surplus packs containing chocolate, boiled sweets, and self-heating beverages. But Hogarth estimated that societies would only take a total of 150 tons of the surplus. So this left only 700 allocated tons of food that could be purchased domestically, but there were no suitable domestic goods that would fit for purpose. And Koptra was left with this large sum of money, but nothing to spend it on. However, Koptra hoped to persuade the British government to release further goods so that it could use these funds that it had on hand and to continue to provide relief to the continent. And Hogarth pressed the government for further foodstuff allocations, so he wanted 750 to 1,000 tons from the government. And these are the foods that he wanted the additional food requests. So again, you can see it's tailored to the specific groups that they're trying to provide for. You can also see that he's asking for kosher foods as well, and these would have gone to Jewish displaced persons in Germany as well as German Jews. So he's this relates to all the different groups that they're working with. But the government found it impossible to provide these additional consumables, and the Ministry of Food made no additional offers of food to Koptra in 1946. The relief fund, the food relief fund, continued to function throughout the year. However, in the restricted food climate, the council took the decision not to launch a fresh appeal for donations. Instead, Koptra looked to other areas of the world to use the funds raised to purchase goods that it could sort of use for its relief agenda. In March 1946, Koptra approached the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, with a request for permission to spend £50,000 on food purchases in Sweden and Switzerland, which Koptra would then distribute to voluntary societies in Europe. However, because the Treasury sought to limit spending on imports to the Sterling area to conserve the country's financial resources, Koptra's request was denied in April. However, the Chancellor reversed his decision in May by agreeing that up to £35,000 could be spent on buying food in Sweden and Switzerland. However, despite granting permission for such purchases, the Chancellor was wary of Koptra's use of sterling, and he wrote, so this is Hugh Dalton here, he expressed the hope that the Council would not take advantage of this concession, except insofar as suitable stocks of food were not available in this country. Once foreign purchase was approved by the Exchequer, Koptra worked with organizations in Sweden and Switzerland to purchase goods including condensed milk, powdered milk, and tinned stewed steak for its food relief efforts. So they had some availability there. Throughout 1946, maintenance and support of the British zone in Germany, which is estimated at £80 million a year, was a significant drain on the British economy. Food levels in the zone were also a continual worry for the British government, as stocks were insufficient to meet needs. Due to supply levels, by March 1946, the official ration in the zone was set at only 1,631 calories a day, so much below the sort of standard 2,000 calorie diet. To conserve resources and reduce the costs associated with occupation, Britain negotiated a deal with the Americans to combine their zones and to create the US-UK-led Bizonia, which came into being on January 1st, 1947. However, the creation of Bizonia did not immediately curb the financial drain on Britain's balance sheet or reduce the amount of financial and material relief that it gave to the zone. The continuing and even expanding need for British aid corresponded with the deteriorating conditions in Germany, as well as the slower response of the United States to supply additional aid. These circumstances had a direct impact on Kopsch's activities on the continent from 1947 onwards. During that year, the Foreign Office renegotiated the terms of Kopsch's 50% funding grant to reflect the additional support needed in Germany as well as in Austria. The new grant from the government came with the stipulation that Kopsch should only use government funds to facilitate his work for those living in Germany and Austria. The changing nature of the British government's grant was in line with Kopsch's own reassessment of its role in Europe. In a letter in November 1947, the Council Secretary, W. D. Hogarth, wrote this, quote, "I suggest that the future work of the Council should be assessed in terms of the future duration and scope of the relief work in Germany and Austria, and the handling of relief supply work here," end quote. As Kopsch was renewing its agreement with the Foreign Office and concentrating the bulk of its activities on Germany and Austria, UNRWA was wrapping up its operations in Europe and handing over much of its work to the UN's International Relief Organization, or the IRO. This shift in the work of the UN on the continent increased the importance of Kopsch's food relief. This change was reflected in Kopsch's 1947 Food Relief Fund appeal to gather further donations for the purchase and dissemination of food to Europe. The appeal, which began in November, was not held nationwide, but targeted only the 9,820 donors that had given to the first appeal in 1945 to 46. And these supporters were sent a 4-page leaflet. This is the cover here of the leaflet, which was asking for further donations. In the appeal, special emphasis was placed on the need to donate money so that Kopsch could help fill the food relief void that was left by UNRWA's withdrawal from Europe, and specifically from Germany and Austria. And so I wanted to show you the excerpt from that. So this is on page 2 of the leaflet. Quote, "In Germany and Austria, ration levels are still only a little over half of what they are in this country, and even so cannot always be honored in full. In most parts of Europe, the drought has brought poor harvests this year, and with the stoppage of UNRWA supplies, the coming winter in many countries will be as critical as the last." End quote. The leaflet then goes on to describe in vivid and depressing language the harsh conditions in Germany and Austria, and underlines the urgency with which help was needed from Britain for the special needs groups. The emphasis on the two countries and the emotive language used, which was absent from the first appeal in 1945, reflects the shifting focus of the British government to feed native Germans and Kopsch's relief efforts to provide for the special needs groups on the continent. Despite the new allocation of British foodstuffs to Germany and Austria, Kopsch was, as with the first appeal, careful to emphasize to the public that there were no donations to the program would not have an impact on the consumption needs of the British home front. Such language was suggestive of the tensions between domestic considerations, foreign policies, and humanitarian commitments the UK government continually negotiated throughout this period, and in conjunction with these shifts in the Anglo-American relationship. Kopsch continued to provide material support to Germany and Austria until 1950, when the withdrawal of British government funding forced the organization to close. Although Kopsch never reached the 9 million tons of food aid that UNRWA was able to provide, the Council had an important impact on the lives of the individuals that it fed and those connected to these individuals. In a 1946 pamphlet, which outlined the work of British voluntary organizations in Germany, Richard Law, who was the chair of Kopsch, again you see him here, underlined the significance of these relief activities. So, quote, "The direct material help which they bring is but a small physical alleviation of the distress all around, but their presence is a token of goodwill, an example of personal service, which should help to restore morale and provide encouragement to an even wider circle than those with whom they are brought in contact." End quote. Much as Kopsch's food relief was directed to Germany, the organization's 1948 annual report shows that between 1944 and 1947, Germany received the largest amount of food, with 1,332 tons, which cost the organization 137,442 pounds. In total, over this period, COPSA directed over 4,000 tons of food to Europe, which cost the organization over 457,000 pounds. It has been argued in this paper that COPSA's ability to send food relief to the continent, specifically to Germany, was contingent on the political and economic climate of the United Kingdom at the close of the Second World War and the post-war period. The Anglo-American relationship, which brought the two countries and their allies' victory, took on new dimensions in the post-war environment. While Britain's power in the world was waning, America's power was waxing. And the two countries were still connected to each other, but their unequal situations left Britain in debt and more economically reliant on the United States. The growing inequality in the US-UK relationship had a direct impact on Britain's ability to support reconstruction efforts on the continent, including its ability to provide food relief. Although Britain and America were partners in the reconstruction of Europe, America called the tune and Britain had little choice but to follow. The US set the framework for voluntary societies working on the continent via the Red Crosses. It determined how Lend-Lease should and should not be utilized. It stipulated the terms of British war debt, and it controlled the largest percentage of the world's wheat supply. These connections and disconnections in the Anglo-American relationship impacted on the amount and types of food that COPSA was able to provide to the continent, particularly to Germany, in order to support the consumption needs of women, children, the elderly, and the infirmed. And I want to leave you tonight with these two additional images. So the images also come from the archive of the Salvation Army, and they showed German children receiving British food relief, which was facilitated by COPSA. So the photograph on the left shows children lining up to receive their daily dose of cod liver oil. They were sort of continually selling these barrels of cod liver oil to German children. Whether they liked it or not, it's unclear. And the image on the right here depicts children receiving a piece of chocolate as a bedtime snack. So the British government navigated the sometimes contested and constrained Anglo-American relationship to utilize its limited food and financial resources to provide supplemental food to COPSA in order to feed those in need, including these German children.